Hello and welcome. This is Barrett at the C4 Cyber Club here at Cypress College. And in this lab today, we're going to cover the Ethical Hacking Lab series for ARP spoofing and man-in-the-middle attacks. So this is a really nice lab because a lot of times when you learn about these type of attacks, it's really hard to put it into context until you actually see it happening. So in this lab, we're going to do ARP spoofing with the Ettercap tool. And we'll see how we can capture usernames and passwords using that once we have poisoned the ARP cache. And then we're going to also look at manipulating HTTP and JavaScript once we have that man-in-the-middle status, right? So, and essentially what happens and why we need to spoof or poison these ARP caches, essentially on a local area network. And if you've taken Cisco networking, for example, you're familiar with ARP. It stands for Address Resolution Protocol, and essentially local networks have ARP tables that basically map a host's IP address with its MAC address, and this is how a network identifies all of the different systems. Now, what we're going to be doing using Ettercap is we're going to send malicious ARP requests that will basically say, this IP and this IP, they both have the MAC address of X, where X is the actual MAC address of the attacker machine, of the Kali machine. So what's going to happen is, if there's no defenses in place, it's going to the gateway will just automatically assume like, oh, you're sending to 192.168.0.30. Well, I've been told that that is this MAC address, so it's going to go here. So that's essentially what is happening there. But like I said, it's better understood as we do it. So hopefully that will start to make sense as we move along in the lab. So I've already logged in to both the Kali and the OpenSUSE machine. We'll be using both of those in this lab. So I recommend that you just go ahead and get those logged in. Log in for Kali is root, password is TOOR, and for OpenSUSE, not open source, OpenSUSE is osboxes.org for the password. All right, so we have to do a quick configuration change on the network adapter on the Kali machine before we begin. So you'll click in the top right corner here. We're going to disconnect the ETH0 network, and then we're going to connect the ETH1. So this is going to be necessary for us to do this kind of ARP spoofing and man-in-the-middle activity. Okay, and then you could double check. Okay, we have a wired connection to ETH1. And we can confirm that that's been changed also in the command line. So if you have your terminal open, important to note there's two ways that you can get your IP address and MAC address information on Linux. The old way is ifconfig, and you'll still see people using this. This is getting sunset or deprecated. So you may, in fact, I think newer versions of Kali, it may not be installed by default anymore. But ifconfig is one. So when we type that in, we notice it pulls up all of our network adapters and it shows our local loopback. We also see a Docker information for our Docker containers. Now we were originally using ETH0, but remember we disconnected that. So now we're using ETH1 and we see, okay, this is our IP address, 192.168.0.2. And then it also does show our MAC address. So that's under Ether. And this is essentially what we will be telling the other IP addresses to send back to. we're gonna do some ARP cache poisoning. We're gonna say, hey, this IP and this IP, they both have this MAC address. That's why we're gonna take over as a man in the middle, because those all of that data and information is going to come back to us. Now, I mentioned there's two ways to get IP and MAC address information. So we used ifconfig, and the other one is the command is IP. And then you could type out fully address. You'll notice in the lab it abbreviates to ADDR. Now, the output is slightly different, but very similar information. So we have our different network adapters. We have our ETH1. We have our IP address. You also notice it also includes the CIDR notation that's telling you what the subnet mask is. And we have our MAC address up here. So slightly different, but IP is the more current version of this tool. So that's what you'll definitely see in all future distro updates for whether it's Kali, whether it's Ubuntu, Debian, all the other various distributions. And you could even type IPA as well if you really want to get very streamlined and type as little as possible. Okay, so moving on, we've got we understand our network adapter. We've got it changed to ETH1. Now let's go ahead and launch Ettercap, and to do that, we'll type Ettercap -G, and that opens up pretty quickly. So you notice in the lab it recommends that we full screen this. It will make sense in a moment. And essentially, we just need to set our interface to ETH1. And then we press the checkbox up here, and we notice a little terminal opens down here, started unified sniffing. So now we are actively going to attempt to sniff the network. You can raise this up for a little bit more viewing space. And now next up, we want to click the scan for hosts. So the little magnifying glass in the top left. So it's scanning our subnet mask. Remember, we're on a /24, so our subnet mask is 255.255.255.0, which leaves us with 255 hosts. So it scanned all of those. We found 2 hosts, and those were added to the host list. Well, whereas the host list is right up here next to the magnifying glass. So we'll click on that. And so this is a good example of like what an ARP table looks like. So it is just IP addresses matched to the MAC address. So you notice that both of these MAC addresses are different, and these coincide with this machine here, and then also this pfSense firewall, or you can kind of think of this as the default gateway or router, essentially. And next step, we need to add both of these to target 1 and target 2. So we want to make sure this first IP, the .30, is highlighted. Simple as this, add to target 1. Host has been added. Click on the next one, add to target 2. That host has been added. So now we're able to sniff traffic, but we haven't technically poisoned ARP yet. We haven't sent out those mal-informed or malformed, I should say, ARP packets, but we want to go ahead and click the man in the middle menu and then choose ARP poisoning here. And this, you could leave this on the default settings. We're going to press OK. And you can see it happening down here, ARP poisoning victims. And it's as simple as that. This, like I said, I know I keep saying it, it's as simple as that. This tool makes it very easy to send these requests. So moving on to the next part, now that we are acting as a man in the middle, let's see this in action. So we're going to go to the OpenSUSE machine. We'll launch Firefox. Essentially, all we're doing here, okay, let's pretend we're remotely wanting to administer our pfSense firewall. So we are connecting to that, through the network to its IP, and we're going to log in. Now, keep in mind, we're logged in, or we're using HTTP on port 80 right now. And remember, this is, it autofills the password. Remember, port 80 HTTP is clear text. It's unencrypted. So that's going to be a problem because we have somebody sitting here sniffing the traffic as a man in the middle. So we see that request happen. Okay, user signed in. Now if we scroll over, we see username field, admin, password is pfSense. So this is a good example of why you want to use HTTPS, which runs on port 443 because it is encrypted. So we could have still sniffed that traffic, but we wouldn't have been able to read it. We wouldn't have been able to look at it here and say, oh yeah, here's the username, here's the password, because it would have been encrypted. So that's a layer of protection that's going to give you confidentiality, right? If you're thinking about the CIA triad, it's going to add confidentiality. All right, so let's move on to actually manipulating HTTP images. So remember, we're still man in the middle. We're capturing everything as requests are made. So let's go back to the OpenSUSE machine, and we will visit a website that resides on the OWASP BWA machine. So remember, we're connecting to this down here. We're just viewing the web page. Looks normal. Okay. But what we can do is we can launch a web server on our Kali machine to essentially manipulate that on the fly as requests are being made to various websites, and we could alter that information. So let's take a look at where these filters, they're called filters that we can load into Ettercap. So if we go to our file manager, they are located, so in this root folder here, we have a filters folder. And the first one we're going to take a look at is logo filter. So essentially, this is just code that is going to look for, okay, if the protocol is TCP and the destination is port 80, so it's on HTTP, it's going to get rid of the accept encoding message. And then what it can do is it's going to replace, so this is kind of like HTML for image source. It's going to replace whatever image the website originally had programmed in, and it's going to replace it with an image that's located on the Kali's server and logo.jpg. Right, so this is a way to just completely, this isn't manipulating on technically on the server side, it's more on the client side, whoever's making the requests. And because we're in the middle, we're able to then kind of edit it on the fly, right? So, and then this message here, images have been replaced. This is referring to output displayed in the Ettercap terminal. Okay, so now that we've looked at that, let's first thing we need to do is start our web server on our Kali machine, or else we would have nowhere to direct this filter to. Remember, it's replacing what was originally there on, whoops, sorry, not that one, on this website. So it's going to replace these images, and it needs a web server to be launched to, so this is accessible. So that's why we need to launch a web server on the Kali machine. And the web server for Linux, one of the most popular, is Apache. Okay, so I'm going to launch terminal, and the command for this is just service Apache to start. And if you want to double check and verify that it is indeed running, you can say service Apache 2 status, and we can see it is active and running. And you can press Q to exit out of there. All right, so we looked at the filter, and we can close this terminal here now that that's running. So we looked at the filter, but we need to load it into Ettercap. So we'll click on the 3 dots up here, go to filters, load a filter. And remember, this was on the en route filters, and we're working with logo on this one, and it's going to be logo.ef. So we'll double click on, or I'm sorry, not double click. It doesn't allow a double click. You actually have to press OK up here. Okay, content filters loaded. Okay, and if we come back to the OpenSUSE machine, reopen Firefox if you had that closed, and we just visit the owasp.bwa IP address again. And now we notice that all of these images have changed. So this is this right here, this URL, this logo.jpg, which resides on the Kali web server. We are intercepting the request that the OpenSUSE machine is making. So OpenSUSE machine is requesting the website from here, but we are intercepting that information and manipulating it to display this image. And obviously you can think this could get much worse, right? This is a pretty harmless way to manipulate, but obviously we could add all kinds of malicious code in here that gets executed immediately. And that kind of takes us to the next portion too, where we're going to manipulate JavaScript. So we're going to take it a little bit step further. So back on the Kali machine, let's go ahead and take a look at the filter related to that. So I'm going to go back to File Manager. We're going to go to Filters, and we will look at the Hacked Alert filter. So very similar to before, we're looking for a TCP protocol. Destination is port 80. We're going to trash this accept encoding message. And so down here, we're going to be looking for the end of the HTML header. So in HTML, there's usually a header section at the top. It's denoted between head and then a /head, denoting that it's the end of that. And so it's going to look for that end of the header, and then it's going to inject this JavaScript. And this is very, very simple. There's nothing malicious about this, but it's often used by testers to see if a website is vulnerable to JavaScript or SQL injection, things like that. So all we're doing is we're causing an alert to pop up, and that alert is going to say you got hacked. And so this will be, because it's right after the header, it's going to be the first thing that happens. So likely you're just going to see a pop up. You're going to probably have to press OK, and then you'll see the rest of the website load as normal. And then the message here, you notice this will display this output to the Ettercap terminal. Okay, So we looked at the filter, we close that. Now remember, we need to load the filter into Ettercap. So we'll go filters, load a filter. We need to go to home, filters, and we need to use the hackedalert.ef. Okay, content filters loaded. Okay, and then we'll come back to the OpenSUSE machine. I'm just going to go ahead and open up a new tab, and let's revisit the OWASP BWA machine. And so you notice here is our JavaScript alert. So you got hacked. I press OK, and then the rest of the site loads. Okay. One thing I wanted to mention, if you have trouble where you're loading the filter while you're doing this lab, and you notice if you hit refresh or you retype the URL and it doesn't update as you expect from the lab, just close your browser and open it back up. I've noticed some weird things with the cache that prevents some of these things from happening as they should. So a quick stop and start of your browser should fix that. But yeah, so that is the end of the lab as well. So once again, we talked about ARP cache poisoning. We essentially poisoned an ARP table into thinking that the IP addresses of things like the OpenSUSE machine and the gateway here corresponded with the MAC address of our Kali machine. So once that happened, we were the man in the middle, and any of the network traffic that happened through here, we were able to see it. We sniffed a password when we tried to log into the pfSense firewall, and then also we were able to manipulate information on the fly. So we manipulated HTTP images. We launched that web server over here to act as a repository for swapping out a logo, for example. And then finally, in the last section, we injected JavaScript into a legit web request from the OpenSUSE machine over to the OWASP machine, and we injected that alert pop-up, right? So that covers this lab, ARP spoofing and man-in-the-middle attacks. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.